Hello there. If Rishi Sunak is really serious about leaving the ECHR to end small boats crossings, it would be an election winner for the Tories. Following on from Suella Braverman's speech in the US, which we're told was signed off by the Prime Minister, there is mood music in the air of the UK pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights. A first concrete move to stopping the English Channel eternal red-carpeted conveyor belt. The problem I have, though, is that I don't believe the Tories will leave the ECHR, because they've had years to do so, and thus years to sort out the Channel crossings crisis, yet they haven't. Unless, of course, they've been saving this up for the pre-election run-up campaign. But like many of you, I don't trust this Tory party at all, because it could just be smoke and mirrors to deflect away from the level of net legal migration. Anyway, they've been painfully aware of the impact of the ECHR on us, but have just sat on their hands. Now, Braverman's speech opened up the international debate on the ECHR, as well as other international agreements that basically control our borders for us. And by calling for reform of international law on this issue, she was effectively trailing the prospect of the UK walking away from them, as they were no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century. However, the question is, would Rishi Sunak be courageous enough to do so if those like the Council of Europe that owns the ECHR stood firm? Now, the Times says that Rishi Sunak is backing the threat to leave the ECHR on the basis that it might coerce the Supreme Court into deciding the Rwanda scheme is perfectly legal, as well as acting as a sort of warning shot to the courts in Strasbourg to not interfere by slapping another Section 39 order on the next planned flight. But if that is all it is about, then nothing much will change, because the law will not have changed. So the ECHR will still be used by activist lawyers to block any attempt by the UK government to stop irregular migration. And the lawyers acting for pro-open borders activists will no doubt continue to trawl through the cases of those due for the flights to Rwanda and pull them off one by one as they have done before, leaving an empty plane that the Supreme Court says can take off for Rwanda. Something that is currently facilitated by the way the Human Rights Act is drafted. All that would happen is Rishi Sunak would be left looking even weaker than he did. Anyway, any attempt to leave the ECHR would be met with wails of protest by the usual suspects, including from outside the UK, like those in the EU and Biden's US, who would both kick up a stink. Missing the irony that the US has no external court to rule over it at all. And also that the European Union itself, that's the organisation containing the EU Commission, the EU Council of Ministers, the EU Parliament and the European Court of Justice, as well as everything flowing from the treaties, is not covered by the ECHR. Because unlike all its member states, the EU itself, that's Brussels, has not acceded to the ECHR, despite it being a set requirement of the Lisbon Treaty. That's 14 years of Brussels breaching international law, and joining Russia and Belarus on the pariah step. So if the ECHR is not good enough for the Brussels hierarchy, then it should not be good enough for the UK. Now, you may or may not have heard of him, but former Justice of the Supreme Court of the UK, Lord Jonathan Sumption, has penned a piece for The Spectator, saying that no one is advocating that we should leave the ECHR with nothing to replace it. Far from it, he says, we can enact our own human rights laws that better reflect our values. And Sumption points out that the real purpose of the ECHR is to make us accept rights which we may not want. And if the majority of the nation does not want those rights imposed on them, why should we be forced to accept them? It is undemocratic. And what he's talking about here is how the excessive mission creep by ECHR lawyers and judges has turned the ECHR from a carefully focused watchdog into an overbearing set of busybodies interfering in every aspect of our laws. As an example, he cites the notorious Article 8 right to live your life privately without government interference. That has now, Sumption says, been expanded to include just about anything that stops people doing what they want to do. It's now referred to as the right to a family life, as opposed to the true title, Respect for Your Private and Family Life, with the ECHR interpreting it in an ever wider manner. And it looks to me like the list of restrictions on that right, listed under Article 8, like national security, crime and safety, are being totally ignored. And there are others too. In fact, Sumption paints the ECHR system as some sort of burgeoning Supreme Court that has an aim of overseeing everything our Supreme Court does. Now, it's a pity that this Spectator article is behind a paywall. It deserves a far wider readership, because it won't be until people see this sort of thing that they'll realise how deep the ECHR tentacles go, and then rebel against it. In the final analysis, as I read it, Lord Sumption believes that the actions of the ECHR over the years have actually devalued our human rights. It sounds to me more like our rights have been thoroughly eroded in favour of the rest of the world. And looking at the way the ECHR has wheedled its way in should anger all right-minded people. And if the majority of the UK electorate does not want human rights laws effectively weaponised against them and their legitimate interests, then nothing should be able to force us to tolerate it. Now, there is another oft-quoted convention, and that is the UN Convention on Refugees, another set of rules that is being used to force us to open our borders. And here's an interesting chat about that on GB News between Jacob Rees-Mogg and Oliver Westmoreland, senior immigration lawyer at GSN Immigration.
Well, the point, you make the very fair point that we'd have to get 145 other countries to agree to change it. But normally agreements have a means of pulling out. Is there any means of resiling from the convention?
Very easily, Jacob. The Refugee Convention was not embedded in British law in any really strong way. The European Convention on Human Rights was. It was embedded by the Human Rights Act 1998. The Refugee Convention was not embedded in that strong way. It was embedded here and there in some rules, tweaked. It could be easily tweaked out.
Because we have a dualist system. That we have international agreements, but they don't have domestic effect until they're passed by Parliament.
That's quite correct. We can sign international agreements, they're not binding on us until our Parliament has agreed to them.
And this is quite important because ministers can use the royal prerogative to sign agreements, but they obviously can't change domestic law.
Correct.
So are you basically saying that, not that you disagree that it ought to be changed, but that if we change it, we ought to do it in a legal and proper process?
You're absolutely right. As a lawyer, I try and be a technocrat. I try not to have opinion. I know a lot of lawyers do, and they become very famous lefty lawyers. I try and be a technocrat. I try not to have opinions, but we have to follow the law as it is. But I can tell you, if it was politically acceptable, we could withdraw from the Refugee Convention very easily.
So that's really quite important. And what mechanism would we use? We'd have to tell the other signatories, or we'd just have to pass some domestic legislation?
I don't think particularly have to tell anyone, really. They want to know, but we can tweak a few immigration rules and things. We could easily escape from the Refugee Convention if it's politically acceptable, which is a political issue.
Interesting. Now, if the UK started the process to leave these types of bodies, there would of course be howls of outrage from the left. about the UK becoming a pariah state like Russia and Belarus, etc., 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 as well as hordes of civil serpents lining up the administrative and legislative tank traps and roadblocks, of course, because leaving the ECHR makes it more difficult to get back into the EU. But this stems from a minority set of virtue signallers intent on imposing their open borders ideology on the majority who don't want it. And losing the tools of the likes of the ECHR and the Refugee Convention leaves them powerless to foist their dogma on the rest of us. They would rather stride the global stage saying, "Look at me and how virtuous I am," claiming we take more people in than any other country, like being the first at net zero, etc., whether we the people want it or not, or can afford it or not, because at the end of the day, it's all about them and not us.